Chuck Norris had always been a man of action, but tonight he chose quiet observation over drama. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, casting the streets in a soft orange glow from the streetlights. Chuck pulled up to his modest restaurant, Chuck's Place, in a nondescript pickup truck. It wasn't flashy like the sports cars people expected him to drive, but it suited him just fine. He parked around the corner and slipped through the back entrance unnoticed. This wasn't unusual for him. He liked checking on his businesses without fanfare, preferring to see operations unfold naturally rather than staged for his arrival. The Aisha kitchen buzzed with activity as cooks chopped vegetables, flipped steaks on the grill, and shouted orders across counters. Servers darted between tables, balancing trays laden with plates of food. The air smelled of sizzling garlic, freshly baked bread, and something sweet simmering in the oven. Despite all the commotion, there was an underlying rhythm to the chaos, a sign that things were running smoothly. Chuck leaned against the wall near the prep area, arms crossed, watching silently. His presence went largely unnoticed. Even though he owned the place, he didn't demand attention or make grand entrances. That wasn't his style. As he scanned the room, his sharp eyes caught every detail. A dishwasher stacking plates too carelessly, a server laughing too loudly while customers waited patiently at their table. These weren't major issues, but they mattered to Chuck. Running a restaurant wasn't just about serving good food. It was about creating an experience, a memory people would want to return to again and again. Still, nothing seemed out of the ordinary enough to warrant intervention. Everything appeared to be business as usual. But then, amidst the hum of conversation and the clanging of pots and pans, Chuck heard it, a faint, muffled sound. At first, he thought it might be his imagination. After years of martial arts training and combat experience, his senses were finely tuned, almost hyper-aware. But no, it was real. Someone, or something, was crying. The sound was barely audible, drowned out by the noise of the busy kitchen, but it tugged at him insistently. He turned his head slightly, trying to pinpoint its source. Was it coming from outside? No, definitely inside. Closer than that. His gaze swept over the stainless steel appliances, the rows of spices neatly lined up on shelves, and finally landed on the walk-in freezer door. The cries grew clearer as he approached, unmistakably human now. They were soft, desperate, and tinged with fear. Whoever it was, they sounded young, very young. Chuck hesitated only for a moment before gripping the handle of the freezer door. It wasn't locked, which struck him as odd. Normally, freezers required a keycard swipe for access, especially after hours. Pushing the heavy metal, door open, a blast of cold air hit him like a wall. Inside, dim fluorescent lights flickered overhead, illuminating crates of produce stacked along the walls. And there, huddled in the far corner, sat a small figure wrapped tightly in a coat, knees drawn up to her chest. Her breath came in shallow bursts, visible in the freezing air, and tears streamed down her pale cheeks. For a brief second, time seemed to freeze. Chuck stood motionless, taking in the scene. Then, stepping forward with deliberate calmness, he crouched down beside the girl. She looked up at him, wide-eyed, startled by his sudden appearance. For a moment, neither spoke. The icy silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of her ragged breathing. "Are you okay?" Chuck asked finally, his deep voice steady and reassuring. The girl blinked rapidly as if unsure whether she was dreaming. You're Chuck Norris," she stammered, her teeth chattering not entirely from the cold. Chuck nodded once. "That's right. Now tell me, what are you doing in here?" She hesitated, glancing toward the open freezer door as if expecting someone else to appear. When no one did, she lowered her gaze and muttered, I got stuck. How long have you been in here?" Chuck pressed gently, already assessing her condition. Her lips were tinged blue and her hands trembled uncontrollably. He reached out and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, both to comfort her and to gauge how severe her exposure to the cold had been. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice cracking. "Maybe an hour, maybe more." Chuck frowned. An hour in sub-zero temperatures could be dangerous, especially for a child. "Let's get you warmed up," he said firmly, scooping her into his arms before she could protest. She was light, fragile, even, and clung to him instinctively as he carried her out of the freezer and into the warmth of the kitchen. Once outside, several staff members noticed the commotion and rushed over. "What happened?" one of them exclaimed, looking alarmed. "This little one was locked in the freezer," Chuck explained tersely, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Get me a blanket and some hot water bottles, quick." While they scrambled to comply, Chuck set the girl down on a stool near the prep counter. He draped a thick towel around her shoulders and knelt in front of her, meeting her gaze levelly. "Now," he began, his voice softer but still firm. "Let's start from the beginning. Who are you, and why were you in my freezer?" The girl swallowed hard, clearly torn between fear and relief. Finally, she whispered, "My name is Emily." "And who brought you here, Emily?" Chuck prodded gently, sensing there was more to her story. She hesitated again, biting her lip nervously. "No one brought me," she said quickly, avoiding his eyes. "I came alone." Chuck studied her closely, noting the way her fingers twisted, together anxiously. Something about her explanation didn't sit right with him. Kids didn't just wander into industrial freezers by accident, and certainly not without someone noticing. Yet instead of pushing further, he simply nodded. "All right, Emily, let's focus on getting you warm first. We can talk more later." As the staff returned with blankets and supplies, Chuck made sure Emily was comfortable before excusing himself briefly. Stepping aside, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Whatever the truth behind Emily's presence in the freezer, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to end here. Not until he understood exactly what had happened and ensured it never happened again. As Emily sat wrapped in layers of blankets, her shivers slowly began to subside. The warmth of the kitchen enveloped her like a cocoon, and the worried glances from the staff softened into looks of relief. Chuck Norris stood nearby, his towering frame exuding calm authority as he observed the scene unfold. Though he had already ensured Emily was safe and comfortable, his mind raced with questions. Something about her story didn't add up. How could a child end up locked inside an industrial freezer without anyone noticing? And why hadn't she called for help sooner? Chuck crouched down beside her again, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "Emily," he said gently, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I need you to tell me everything. You're safe now, I promise. But I can't help unless I know the truth." Emily hesitated, her small hands clutching the edges of the blanket tightly. She glanced around at the bustling kitchen, where chefs were chopping vegetables and servers were rushing orders. Everyone seemed too busy to pay attention to their quiet exchange, but still, she leaned closer to Chuck. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I wasn't supposed to be here," she admitted, her words tumbling out in a rush. "My brother works here and he sneaks me in sometimes when Mom's working late. We play hide and seek in the restaurant after closing time." Chuck nodded slowly, encouraging her to continue. It wasn't uncommon for siblings to find ways to entertain themselves, especially when left unsupervised. But there was something more, something she wasn't saying yet. "So you were playing hide and seek tonight?" Chuck prompted, keeping his tone neutral. Emily nodded, her lower lip trembling. "Yeah. Jake said we could stay late because no one else was around. He promised it would be okay." She paused, her gaze dropping to the floor. "But then, we got into a fight." "A fight?" Chuck asked, raising an eyebrow slightly. "What kind of fight?" Her voice cracked as tears welled up in her eyes again. "He owes me money. He borrowed it for lunch last week, and I told him I needed it back today. But he said he didn't have it. We yelled at each other and then he pushed me into the freezer." Chuck's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. While sibling arguments weren't unusual, locking someone in a freezing cold storage unit crossed a dangerous line. "Did he mean to shut you in there?" Chuck asked carefully, wanting to give her space to explain without jumping to conclusions. Emily shook her head vigorously. "No, at first I thought it was just part of the game. But when I tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. I called out for him, but he didn't come back. I think he forgot about me. Forgotten or abandoned. Chuck didn't say it aloud, but the thought lingered in his mind. He studied Emily's face closely, searching for any signs of deception. Children often twisted the truth to protect those they cared about, even if it meant taking the blame themselves. Yet despite her nervousness, there was sincerity in her expression. This wasn't a rehearsed lie. It was raw emotion spilling, out in fragments. "All right," Chuck said, finally standing up straight. His voice carried the weight of authority, but it remained calm and reassuring. "Let's find your brother and sort this out." Emily's eyes widened in panic. "Please don't tell him I told you," she pleaded, grabbing hold of his sleeve, instinctively. "He'll be so mad at me." Chuck placed a comforting hand over hers. "Don't worry," he reassured her. "I'll handle this. Just stay here and rest while I talk to him, okay?" With that, Chuck turned and strode toward the kitchen manager who was overseeing the evening shift. "Where's Jake?" he asked bluntly, cutting through the hum of activity. The manager blinked, caught off guard by Chuck's sudden appearance. "Jake? He should be cleaning tables near the front. Why, is something wrong?" Chuck didn't answer directly. Instead, he motioned for the manager to follow him. Together they made their way to the dining area, where Jake, a lanky teenager, with scruffy hair and a hoodie pulled low over his face, was wiping down a table with half-hearted effort. When he noticed Chuck approaching, his shoulders stiffened visibly and he avoided making eye contact. "Jake," Chuck said firmly, stopping a few feet away. "We need to talk." Jake froze mid-wipe, his rag dangling limply in his hand. Slowly, reluctantly, he looked up. "Mr. Norris," he stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure of Chuck's intense gaze. Is everything okay?" Chuck crossed his arms over his chest, his posture radiating quiet strength. "That depends on how you define okay," he replied evenly. "Why don't you start by telling me what happened tonight?" Jake swallowed hard, beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. I don't know what you mean," he faltered, attempting to feign ignorance. "Nothing unusual happened." Chuck raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Really? Because I found your sister locked in the freezer." If Jake had been nervous before, he was downright terrified now. His face went pale, and the rag slipped from his fingers, landing with a dull thud on the floor. "Oh no," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She's not hurt, is she?" "She's fine for now," Chuck said, his tone firm but not harsh. "But I want to hear your side of the story. What exactly went down between you two?" Jake hesitated, clearly torn between confessing and doubling down on his denial. Finally, he sighed heavily, slumping against the table. "It's my fault," he admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "We got into an argument like she said. She was bugging me about the money I owe her and I lost my temper. I shoved her into the freezer as a joke, thinking she'd get out right away. But then I forgot all about her. I swear I didn't mean to leave her in there." Chuck studied him intently, weighing his words. There was genuine remorse in Jake's voice, but regret alone wasn't enough to undo the harm he'd caused. "Do you realize how dangerous that was?" Chuck asked, his voice sharp enough to cut through Jake's defenses. "That freezer isn't some playground prop. It's a piece of equipment designed to preserve food at sub-zero temperatures. People can die in there, Jake. Your own sister could have died." Jake flinched as if struck, tears welling up in his... "Ian? I'm sorry," he choked out, his voice breaking. I wasn't thinking at all. I just wanted her to stop nagging me." Chuck let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing Jake to sit with the gravity of his mistake. Then, softening his tone slightly, he added, "Being sorry isn't enough. Actions have consequences, son. You put someone's life at risk tonight. Someone who trusts you completely. That's not something you can take lightly." Jake nodded, miserably, unable to meet Chuck's eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes to make it right," he promised, his voice trembling. "Just please don't fire me. I need this job." Chuck tilted his head, considering the plea. On one hand, Jake's actions warranted immediate termination. Endangering another person, especially a child, was unforgivable in any workplace. On the other hand, firing him would solve nothing. It might even push him further down a path of poor decisions. No, Chuck realized, this wasn't just about punishment. It was about teaching responsibility and redemption. "Here's what's going to happen," Chuck said after a pause, his voice steady and deliberate. "You're going to apologize to Emily, not just a quick sorry, but a real apology. And starting tomorrow, you'll report directly to me. Every day you'll work extra hours to repay the trust you broke. If you mess up again, even once, you're done. Do you understand?" Jake nodded eagerly, relief washing over his features. "Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Norris. I won't let you down." Chuck gave him a long, measured look before turning away. "See that you don't," he said simply. Back in the kitchen, Emily watched anxiously as Chuck returned. Before she could ask anything, he knelt beside her and smiled faintly. "Your brother's coming to apologize," he told her. "And things are going to change around here. From now on, everyone will be held accountable for their actions." Emily blinked, her tear-streaked face lighting up with hope. "Does that mean Jake isn't in trouble anymore?" Chuck chuckled softly, ruffling her hair. "Let's just say he's getting a second chance. But remember, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning and growing together." As the evening wore on, the tension in the restaurant eased, replaced by a sense of resolution. For Chuck, it was a reminder that leadership wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about guiding people toward better choices. And for Emily and Jake, it was a lesson they wouldn't soon forget, that mistakes could shape them, but only if they chose to learn from them. As the night wore on, the restaurant began to quiet down. The dinner rush had ended, and most of the customers had left, leaving behind a calm hum of cleanup activity. Emily sat in Chuck's office, wrapped snugly in a blanket, sipping hot cocoa that one of the servers had brought her. Her shivers had stopped, but her eyes still darted nervously toward the door every time it opened. She wasn't sure what was going to happen next, whether Jake would storm in yelling or if Chuck would decide they weren't allowed back at the restaurant ever again. Chuck stood outside the office for a moment, watching her through the cracked door. Despite everything, there was something endearing about her resilience. She looked small and fragile sitting there, yet she carried herself with a quiet determination that reminded him of his own childhood. Growing up poor in Oklahoma, he'd faced plenty of challenges himself, and he knew how hard it could be when family problems spilled over into everyday life. He didn't want to punish Emily and Jake. He wanted to help them. But first, he needed to understand the full picture. With that thought, Chuck turned and headed back toward the dining area where Jake was waiting. The teenager sat slumped at a corner table, his head resting in his hands. His hoodie was pulled up now, partially hiding his face, but Chuck could see the guilt written all over him. Jake glanced up as Chuck approached, his expression a mix of fear and shame. "Come with me," Chuck said simply, gesturing toward his office. Jake hesitated for a second, then pushed himself to his feet and followed reluctantly, dragging his sneakers against the tiled floor. When they entered the office, Emily looked up immediately, her grip tightening on the mug of cocoa. For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavy, charged with unspoken emotions. Chuck closed the door gently behind them and took a seat across from the siblings, his posture relaxed but commanding. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "All right," Chuck began, his voice calm but firm. "Let's talk about what really happened tonight, not just the fight, but everything leading up to it." Jake shifted uncomfortably, in his chair, avoiding eye contact. Emily stared down at her lap, clutching the blanket closer around her shoulders. Neither sibling seemed eager to start, so Chuck decided to guide the conversation. "Emily mentioned money earlier," he said, glancing at Jake. "She said you borrowed some from her. Is that true?" Jake nodded slowly, his cheeks flushing, red. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was for lunch last week. I told her I'd pay her back, but I haven't been able to." "Why not?" Chuck asked, tilting his head slightly. There was no accusation in his tone, just curiosity. Jake hesitated, fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie. Finally, he sighed and admitted, "Because I don't have any money right now, not even for myself." That revelation hung in the air like a storm cloud. Chuck studied Jake carefully, noticing the dark circles under his eyes and the worn-out patches on his hoodie. This wasn't just laziness or carelessness, it was desperation. Something bigger was going on here. "And why don't you have money?" Chuck pressed gently, giving Jake space to explain without feeling interrogated. Jake swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable sharing personal details with someone he barely knew. But after a long pause, he finally spoke. "My parents, they're struggling," he admitted quietly. "Dad lost his job a few months ago and Mom works double shifts at the hospital just to keep things running. I've been trying to help out by working here, but..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "It's not enough." Chuck nodded slowly, piecing together the story. "So you've been using your paycheck to help your family," he concluded. Jake gave a slight nod, confirming his suspicion. "What, about your sister?" Chuck asked, turning his attention to Emily. "Does she know about this?" Emily shook her head quickly, looking surprised. "No, I didn't know," she said softly. "I thought Jake was just being selfish." "I didn't want you to worry," Jake explained, his voice tinged with frustration. "You're already dealing with enough crap at home. I didn't think telling you would make anything better." Chuck leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of their words settle. It was clear now that this wasn't just a case of sibling rivalry gone wrong. It was a symptom of deeper issues. Jake was carrying more responsibility than any teenager should have to bear, and his stress had boiled over into reckless behavior. Meanwhile, Emily, unaware of the financial strain her family was under, had interpreted Jake's actions as neglectful and selfish. Miscommunication had driven a wedge between them, culminating in tonight's incident. But while understanding the root cause was important, it didn't excuse Jake's actions. Chuck knew he had to address that directly before moving forward. Leaning forward again, he fixed Jake with a steady gaze. "You're doing your best to take care of your family, and I respect that," Chuck said evenly. "But locking your sister in a freezer is never okay. Not as a joke, not as punishment, not for any reason. Do you understand that?" Jake nodded solemnly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yes, sir," he whispered. "I messed up big time. I'll never do it again." Chuck held his gaze for a moment longer, ensuring the message sank in. Then, softening his tone, he added, "Good. Because mistakes are part of life, but owning up to them is what makes us stronger. Now let's figure out how to fix this together." Turning to Emily, Chuck continued, "Your brother loves you, Emily. He may not always show it the right way, but he's trying his best. And sometimes, when people are overwhelmed, they make bad decisions. That doesn't mean they don't care about you." Emily blinked rapidly, processing his words. After a moment, she nodded slowly, though her expression remained uncertain. "Okay," she murmured. "But will he stop forgetting about me?" The question caught Chuck off guard, tugging at his heartstrings. It wasn't just about the freezer incident. It was about trust. Emily needed reassurance that Jake wouldn't abandon her, whether literally or emotionally. "That's a promise we're going to make tonight," Chuck said firmly, looking between the siblings. "Jake, you need to apologize properly. Not just say sorry, but show Emily that you're committed to being there for her. Can you do that?" Jake nodded eagerly, leaning forward in his chair. "I swear, Em," he said earnestly, meeting her gaze for the first time since entering the office. "I'll never put you in danger again. I'll always check on you no matter what." Emily studied him for a moment, searching his face for sincerity. Finally, she gave a small, tentative smile. "Okay," she said softly. "I forgive you." The tension in the room lifted slightly, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. Chuck watched the exchange with satisfaction, knowing that forgiveness was the first step toward healing. But he also knew that apologies alone weren't enough. Real change required action and accountability. Standing up, Chuck clapped his hands together lightly, drawing their attention back to him. "All right, here's the plan," he announced. "Jake, starting tomorrow, you'll report directly to me. You'll work extra hours to repay the damage caused tonight, not just financially, but by proving you can handle responsibility. If you slip up even once, you're done. Understood?" Jake nodded vigorously, relief washing over his features. "Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Norris." "And Emily," Chuck added, turning to her with a warm smile. "You're welcome to visit any time, but only during regular hours, okay? No more sneaking in after closing." Emily grinned, her earlier anxiety melting away. "Deal," she chirped, happily. As the siblings left the office together, their bond visibly stronger than before, Chuck couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. This hadn't been an easy situation to navigate, but by addressing the underlying issues and fostering open communication, he'd helped them take the first steps toward rebuilding their relationship. Sometimes, leadership wasn't about enforcing rules, it was about guiding people toward growth, and tonight Chuck had done exactly that. The next morning, the restaurant buzzed with a different kind of energy. The sun streamed through the windows, casting golden light over the freshly cleaned tables and gleaming countertops. It was early, and most of the staff hadn't arrived, but Jake was already there, standing nervously near the kitchen entrance. His hoodie was gone, replaced by the restaurant's standard uniform, a crisp black polo shirt tucked neatly into khaki pants. He looked more put together than he had the night before, though his hands still fidgeted anxiously as he waited for Chuck to arrive. When Chuck walked in carrying a clipboard and a cup of coffee, Jake straightened up immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Norris," he said quickly, his voice tinged with nervousness. "I'm ready to get started." Chuck gave him a brief nod, his expression unreadable. "Morning, Jake. Let's talk about your schedule." He gestured toward a nearby table, inviting Jake to sit down. As they settled into their seats, Chuck opened the clipboard and pulled out a sheet of paper. On it was a detailed plan outlining Jake's new responsibilities and consequences if he failed to meet them. "First things first," Chuck began, his tone calm but firm. "You'll be working extra hours every day after school until you've made up for what happened last night. That includes cleaning duties, inventory checks, and assisting the chefs during prep time. You'll also report directly to me at the end of each shift so I can track your progress." Jake nodded silently, his eyes scanning the list of tasks. Some of them seemed straightforward enough, sweeping floors, wiping down tables. But others, like helping the chefs, were unfamiliar territory. He swallowed hard, wondering how he'd manage everything on top of his already packed schedule. "I know this might feel overwhelming," Chuck continued, noticing Jake's hesitation. "But remember, this isn't just about punishment. It's about teaching you accountability and discipline. If you handle these responsibilities well, you'll prove to yourself and everyone else that you're capable of stepping up when it matters." Jake glanced up, surprised by the encouragement in Chuck's voice. For a moment, he forgot his nerves and felt a flicker of determination. "I won't let you down, sir," he promised, his voice steadier now. Chuck smiled faintly. "I believe you won't, but there's one more thing we need to address." He paused, leaning forward slightly. "Last night, Emily told me something interesting. She said she caught you doing something dishonest recently. Care to explain?" Jake froze, his face turning pale. He hadn't expected that question, or rather he'd hoped Chuck wouldn't bring it up. Slowly, he lowered his gaze, unable to meet Chuck's piercing stare. She saw me taking money from the register," he admitted reluctantly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't much, just $20, but I needed it for groceries." Chuck raised an eyebrow, his expression stern. "Stealing is stealing, Jake. Doesn't matter how much or why. What part of our agreement last night made you think this was acceptable?" Jake flinched, guilt washing over him. I didn't mean to," he stammered. "Things have been tight at home and I thought no one would notice. I swear it was only that one time." Chuck studied him closely, searching for any sign of dishonesty. When he was satisfied that Jake was telling the truth, he sighed deeply. "Look, I understand you're under a lot of pressure," he said, his tone softening slightly. "But stealing isn't the answer. Not only does it break trust, but it sets a dangerous precedent. Once you start cutting corners, it becomes easier to justify bigger mistakes. Jake hung his head, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. "I know," he whispered. "I messed up again. I don't deserve another chance." "That's where you're wrong," Chuck countered firmly. "Everyone deserves a second chance, if they're willing to work for it, and that's exactly what you're going to do." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook, sliding it across the table toward Jake. "This is your accountability journal," he explained. "Every day, you'll write down 3 things: what you accomplished, what challenges you faced, and how you plan to improve tomorrow. At the end of each week, we'll review it together. This will help you stay focused and reflect on your growth." Jake picked up the notebook hesitantly, running his fingers over its smooth cover. "Okay," he murmured, his voice filled with resolve. "I'll do it." "Good," Chuck said, standing up. "Now, let's get to work. The sooner you start proving yourself, the sooner you'll rebuild the trust you lost." Over the next few days, Jake threw himself into his tasks with surprising dedication. He arrived at the restaurant promptly after school, eager to tackle whatever assignments Chuck had lined up for him. At first, some of the older staff members teased him lightly, calling him Chuck Shadow because he followed the legendary owner around like a loyal apprentice. But as the days passed, they began to notice a change in Jake. He wasn't just completing his duties, he was excelling at them. His attention to detail impressed even the head chef, who grudgingly admitted that Jake had a knack for organizing ingredients efficiently. One afternoon, while Jake was restocking shelves in the pantry, Emily popped, her head inside, grinning mischievously. "Hey, big bro," she chirped. "Need any help?" Jake turned, startled, then relaxed when he saw her cheerful face. "Hey, squirt," he replied, ruffling her hair affectionately. "Shouldn't you be doing homework or something?" Emily shrugged, plopping down on a crate of potatoes. "Finished it already. Besides, Mom said I could hang out here for a bit since she's working late. So, what you doing?" "Inventory," Jake said, holding up a clipboard. "Making sure we have enough supplies for the weekend rush." Emily wrinkled her nose. "Sounds boring." "It kinda is," Jake admitted with a laugh. "But someone's gotta do it." They fell into an easy conversation, chatting about school, friends, and random nonsense. It was the first time in weeks they'd spent quality time together without arguing, and Jake couldn't help but feel grateful for the small moment of normalcy. As Emily chattered away, he realized how much he'd missed her company and how close he'd come to losing it forever. Later that evening, Chuck stopped by the pantry to check on Jake's progress. He found the siblings laughing over a shared joke, their earlier tension completely dissolved. For a moment, he stood silently in the doorway, observing the scene with a quiet smile. Then, clearing his throat, he stepped inside. "Looks like you two are getting along better," he remarked, nodding approvingly. Jake grinned sheepishly. "Yeah, we're trying. Thanks for helping us fix things, Mr. Norris." Chuck waved off the gratitude. "You're the ones doing the hard work," he said simply. "All I did was point you in the right direction." As he left the pantry, Chuck couldn't shake the feeling of pride swelling in his chest. Watching Jake transform from a troubled teenager into a responsible young man reminded him of the power of mentorship. Sure, it took patience and effort, but seeing the results made it all worthwhile. Still, Chuck knew the journey wasn't over yet. There would be setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt along the way. But for now, Jake was on the right path, and that was enough. Weeks turned into months, and the transformation in Jake was nothing short of remarkable. The once quiet and withdrawn teenager had blossomed into a confident young man who carried himself with purpose. His days were packed: school in the morning, work at the restaurant afternoons and evenings, and late nights spent studying or jotting down reflections in his accountability journal. At first, the workload felt overwhelming, but as he settled into a routine, Jake began to thrive. He wasn't just completing tasks. He was excelling at them, and more importantly, he was learning lessons far beyond what any textbook could teach. Chuck Norris kept a close eye on Jake's progress, offering guidance whenever needed, but also giving him space to grow. Every Friday evening, they met in Chuck's office to review the week's entries in the accountability journal. These sessions became something Jake looked forward to, not because they were easy, but because they pushed him to reflect on his actions and think critically about how he could improve. One particular Friday stood out. As Jake flipped through the pages of his notebook, recounting his achievements and challenges from the past week, Chuck noticed something different in his demeanor. Gone was the nervousness that used to plague him during these meetings. Instead, Jake spoke with clarity and confidence, his voice steady as he shared insights about managing stress and balancing responsibilities. "I've been thinking," Jake said hesitantly, pausing mid-sentence. "Maybe I should talk to my parents about everything. Let them know I'm helping out here so they don't have to worry as much." Chuck raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "That's a big step," he replied thoughtfully. "Are you ready for that conversation?" Jake nodded slowly, though uncertainty lingered in his eyes. "I think so. They deserve to know. Plus, maybe it'll take some pressure off Mom if she realizes I'm pulling my weight." Chuck leaned back in his chair, considering the idea. "Being honest with your family is important," he agreed. "But remember, vulnerability isn't weakness, it's strength. Are you prepared for their reaction, whatever it might be?" Jake took a deep breath, nodding again. "Yeah, I've got this." The following Sunday, Jake sat across from his parents at the kitchen table, his heart pounding as he gathered the courage to speak. His father, a burly man with calloused hands and weary eyes, sipped coffee while flipping through the newspaper. His mother, equally exhausted, but perpetually kind, bustled around the kitchen, tidying up dishes from breakfast. Emily sat quietly in the corner, sketching in her notebook, seemingly oblivious to the tension building in the room. "Mom, Dad," Jake began, clearing his throat nervously. Both adults looked up, surprised by the seriousness in his tone. "There's something I need to tell you." His father folded the newspaper and set it aside, giving Jake his full attention. "What is it, son?" he asked gruffly, though concern softened his expression. Jake hesitated for a moment, then plunged ahead. "I messed up recently, really badly. I got into trouble at work and, well, it almost cost me my job." He glanced at his mother, whose face paled slightly. "But Mr. Norris gave me a second chance, and now I'm working extra hours to prove myself. I wanted you guys to know because I don't want you worrying about money anymore. I can help." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Jake held his breath, bracing himself for disappointment or anger, but instead, his mother sank into a chair, tears welling up in her eyes. "Oh, Jake," she whispered, reaching out to take his hand. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" "I didn't want to burden you," Jake admitted softly, his own eyes glistening. "You're already doing so much. I just wanted to make things easier." His father sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. "Son, we're a team. We face problems. Together, not alone. Hiding things only makes it harder for everyone." Jake nodded, relief washing over him. For the first time in months, he felt like part of the family again. The weight of secrecy lifted, replaced by a sense of unity he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Back at the restaurant, Jake's newfound openness translated into better teamwork. He started collaborating more closely with the staff, sharing ideas and offering assistance without being asked. One day, while helping the head chef prep ingredients for dinner service, Jake suggested a new way to organize the spice rack based on frequency of use. The chef raised an eyebrow skeptically, but decided to give it a try. To everyone's surprise, the system worked brilliantly, cutting prep time significantly. "You've got a knack for this," the chef remarked later, clapping Jake on the shoulder. "Ever think about cooking professionally?" Jake laughed awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. "Nah, I'm not that good, just trying to help out." But the comment stuck with him. Over the next few weeks, he found himself drawn to the kitchen, watching intently as the chefs chopped, sautéed, and plated dishes with precision. He even stayed late one evening to practice knife skills under the supervision of a sous chef. By the end of the session, his fingers were sore, but he couldn't stop smiling. Cooking wasn't just about food, it was about creativity, discipline, and bringing people together. For the first time, Jake entertained the idea that maybe this could be more than just a part-time job. Meanwhile, Emily became a regular fixture at the restaurant, tagging along whenever her schedule allowed. She loved spending time with Jake, especially now that their relationship had improved dramatically. Chuck often teased her about becoming the restaurant's unofficial mascot, handing out crayons and coloring sheets to younger customers. Her presence brought a contagious energy to the place, reminding everyone why they were there, to create happy memories for others. One evening, as Emily played near the hostess stand, a customer approached her curiously. "Aren't you the girl who got locked in the freezer?" the woman asked gently, kneeling down to her level. Emily grinned proudly, puffing out her chest. "Yup, but Chuck saved me, and now my brother works super hard to make sure nothing bad happens again." The customer chuckled, clearly charmed. "Well, I'm glad everything turned out okay. And tell your brother he's doing a great job. I've never seen such friendly service anywhere else." Emily beamed, running off to relay the compliment to Jake. When she told him, he blushed furiously but couldn't hide his pride. It was moments like these that reminded him how far he'd come, and how much he still had to prove. As autumn gave way to winter, the restaurant hosted its annual holiday party for employees and their families. Lights twinkled from every corner, and the smell of roasted chestnuts and mulled cider filled the air. Jake stood behind the dessert table, serving slices of pumpkin pie with practiced ease. Across the room, Emily danced happily to Christmas carols playing over the speakers, her laughter ringing out like bells. Chuck watched the scene unfold, standing near the fireplace with a mug of hot chocolate in hand. He spotted Jake glancing over at Emily occasionally, a soft smile playing on his lips. There was a warmth in the boy's eyes that hadn't been there before, a spark of hope and determination. When the party wound down and the guests began to leave, Chuck motioned for Jake to join him outside. The cold night air nipped at their cheeks as they stood beneath the glowing sign of Chuck's place. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, settling gently on the ground. "You've done incredible work, Jake," Chuck said, breaking the silence. "Not just here at the restaurant, but with your family too. I'm proud of you." Jake ducked his head modestly, though a grin tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks, Mr. Norris. I couldn't have done it without your help." Chuck shook his head firmly. "Don't sell yourself short. You put in the effort. All I did was show you the tools. You built the foundation yourself." They stood there for a moment longer, watching the snow fall. Then Jake spoke up, his voice tinged with curiosity. "Do you think I could really do this for a living someday? Like, become a chef or something?" Chuck smiled knowingly. "If you're willing to put in the work, there's no limit to what you can achieve. Just remember, success isn't about shortcuts. It's about perseverance, passion, and always striving to be better than you were yesterday." Jake nodded, absorbing the advice. As they headed back inside, the warmth of the restaurant enveloped them once again. For Jake, it wasn't just a workplace. It was a second home. A place where he'd found purpose, redemption, and a mentor who believed in him when no one else did. And for Chuck, it was proof that sometimes the greatest victories weren't won with fists or fame, but with patience, kindness, and faith in the potential of others. Months passed, and the rhythm of life at Chuck's place settled into a comforting cadence. Jake had become an indispensable part of the team, earning not only respect from his co-workers, but also admiration from customers who noticed his dedication and charm. His transformation wasn't just evident in his work ethic, it showed in the way he carried himself, spoke confidently, and interacted with others. Emily, too, had found her place within the restaurant walls, flitting between tables like a tiny whirlwind of energy, always ready to lend a hand or brighten someone's day with her infectious smile. The bond between the siblings had grown stronger than ever. Gone were the arguments over money or forgotten promises. Instead, they shared quiet moments during breaks, laughing about inside jokes or planning weekend outings together. Their parents, relieved by the newfound harmony in their household, often joined them for meals at the restaurant. It was clear that the family dynamic had shifted. Jake's willingness to open up had paved the way for deeper connections and mutual support. One crisp spring evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Chuck Norris stood outside the restaurant, leaning against the railing of the patio. The air smelled faintly of blooming flowers and freshly grilled meat wafting from the kitchen vents. Inside, the dining room buzzed with laughter and conversation, a testament to the thriving community hub Chuck had created. But tonight, something felt different, not because of the atmosphere, but because of what lay ahead. Earlier that week, Chuck had received news that left him both proud and reflective. A local culinary school had reached out to him, asking if he'd be willing to recommend any promising young individuals for their upcoming scholarship program. Without hesitation, Chuck thought of Jake. Over the past months, Jake had demonstrated not only technical skill in the kitchen, but also leadership qualities that set him apart. Cooking might not have been his original plan, but it had clearly become his passion, and Chuck believed wholeheartedly in nurturing talent wherever it blossomed. Now, standing under the fading light, Chuck waited patiently for Jake to finish his shift. When the teenager finally emerged from the back door, wiping his hands on a towel, Chuck straightened up and motioned for him to join him on the patio. "Hey, Mr. Norris," Jake greeted, his tone casual but respectful. "What's up?" Chuck smiled faintly, gesturing toward the empty chair beside him. "Take a seat, Jake. There's something I want to talk to you about." Jake hesitated for a moment before sitting down, curiosity flickering across his face. "Is everything okay?" "More than okay," Chuck replied, his voice warm. "I got a call from the headmaster of a culinary school downtown. They're offering scholarships to students who show potential in the kitchen, and I recommended you." Jake blinked, stunned. "You... what? Me?" "Yes, you," Chuck said firmly, chuckling at Jake's disbelief. "Don't act so surprised. You've worked hard, shown initiative, and proven yourself time and again. This is your chance to take things to the next level." For a moment, Jake sat speechless, his mind racing with possibilities. Then slowly, doubt crept into his expression. "But what if I'm not good enough? What if I mess this up too?" Chuck leaned forward, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Jake, let me tell you something. Success isn't about being perfect. It's about learning from your mistakes and pushing forward. Look how far you've come since that night in the freezer. Do you think anyone would have guessed then that you'd be sitting here today being offered a scholarship to culinary school?" Jake shook his head, still unsure. "I guess not." "Exactly," Chuck continued. "And do you know why? Because you didn't give up. You faced your problems head on, took responsibility, and kept improving. That's what makes someone worthy. Not perfection, but perseverance." Jake swallowed hard, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "Thank you, Mr. Norris, for everything. I don't know where I'd be without your guidance." Chuck waved off the gratitude with a dismissive gesture. "This isn't about me, Jake. It's about you proving to yourself that you're capable of greatness. Now, are you going to apply for the scholarship or not?" Jake nodded resolutely, determination blazing in his eyes. "Yes, sir. I'll do it." Over the following weeks, Jake poured all his energy into preparing for the scholarship application process. He practiced knife skills late into the night, experimented with recipes at home, and sought feedback from the chefs at the restaurant. Emily cheered him on enthusiastically, drawing motivational posters and leaving sticky notes around the house with phrases like, "You've got this," scrawled in colorful markers. Even his parents pitched in, helping him polish his essay and rehearse interview questions. When the big day arrived, Jake dressed in his best outfit, a neatly pressed shirt and slacks borrowed from his father, and headed to the culinary school for the final evaluation. As he walked through the doors, clutching his portfolio tightly, he couldn't help but feel a surge of nerves. But then he remembered Chuck's words. Success isn't about being perfect, it's about perseverance. Taking a deep breath, he squared his shoulders and stepped into the classroom. The judges watched intently as Jake prepared a dish he'd spent weeks perfecting, a savory chicken pot pie with a golden brown crust and fragrant herbs. His hands moved with precision, every chop and stir executed flawlessly. When he presented the finished plate, the aroma alone drew murmurs of approval from the panel. By the end of the session, Jake felt a sense of pride he hadn't experienced before, not because he expected to win, but because he knew he'd given it his all. A few days later, Jake returned to the restaurant after school, his face pale and tense. Chuck noticed immediately and pulled him aside. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern etched on his features. "I didn't get the scholarship," Jake admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "They said I was close, but not quite there." For a moment, silence hung between them. Then, to Jake's surprise, Chuck smiled. "That's all right, son. Sometimes success doesn't come on the first try. What matters is that you tried, and that you're willing to keep trying." Jake looked up, startled. "You mean I should apply again next year?" "Absolutely," Chuck said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Use this experience to improve. Learn from the feedback, refine your skills, and come back stronger. Remember, champions aren't made overnight. They're forged through persistence." Jake nodded slowly, a spark of hope reigniting in his chest. "Okay, I'll do it." The seasons changed and the restaurant continued to thrive. Jake remained a steadfast presence, working tirelessly toward his goals. Emily grew older, her visits becoming less frequent as she juggled school activities and friendships. Yet whenever she stopped by, she made sure to check in with her brother, proudly boasting about his progress to anyone who would listen. Their parents, meanwhile, marveled at how much their children had matured, grateful for the stability and joy that Chuck's place had brought into their lives. Chuck, for his part, watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. He hadn't opened the restaurant seeking recognition or fame. He simply wanted to create a space where people could connect, share stories, and build memories. And in doing so, he'd unintentionally sparked a ripple effect of growth and healing. From Jake's redemption to Emily's unwavering optimism, the restaurant had become more than just a business. It was a beacon of hope and resilience. On a particularly busy Friday evening, as the kitchen buzzed with orders and the dining room filled with laughter, Chuck stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. Standing beneath the glowing sign of Chuck's Place, he reflected on the journey that had unfolded within those walls. It wasn't the grand gestures or heroic feats that defined true strength. It was the small, everyday acts of kindness, patience, and belief in others that truly mattered. Behind him, the sound of Jake's voice rang out as he greeted customers, warmly, his confidence shining brighter than ever. Chuck smiled softly to himself, knowing that the legacy of Chuck's Place would live on, not just in its food, but in the lives it touched.